Piersas Morganas, bet čia aš turėtų būti, iš tikrųjų nežinau, kokio kalibro čia pokalbis bus, bet pokalbis su Johnu Petersonu. Dabar Petersonas, kaip tik buvom jo pokalbį Lietuvoje ir tada mes aptarėm pas mane stream'e, YouTube yra video, žinai, kokie ten įspūdžiai, viską to įjungsiu aš čia. Ir vienas iš klausimų, kuriuos kėliau, kokia publika, kaip galvoja, ten rinkosi maždaug, kokie žmonės ir panašiai. Na ir trumpai tariant, mes turim dabar jau fotkių keletą. Štai kokia publika rinkosi, tai mūsų Sinicos rinkosi ir Orlauskai rinkosi, kurie beje mokėjo papildomus pinigus, kad eitų į tą meet and greet ir nusifotkintų, which is, mano nuomonė, yra visiškai fucking ridiculous, bet yra labai logiška, kad jie ėjo, ypač Sinica. Nes Sinica tai, visą ideologiją savo ir visą pasaulėžiūrą realiai vos ne viens prie vieno jau daug metų kopijuoja nuo Amerikos tų visokių, ir aišku, Jorno Petersoną. Kartais net viens prie vieno argumentus girdžiu, kur realiai jau Amerikoje debatuose girdėjęs kaip 10 kartų debankina tą, bet jis čia Lietuvoje juos tiesiog išverčia ir atpasakoja ir panašiai. Orlauskas rašė, kad kažkur kitur užsitiko, ne? Aš nežinau, aš nesiku Orlauską, aš tik tą fotkę mačiau. Aš girdėjau, kai jisai ten irgi buvo, bet anyway, nesvarbu. Tai apie Petersoną galima daug šnekėti, bet jo, aš sakyčiau, iš psichologinių dalykų daugam, aš net neturiu kompetencijų, kad jau ginčytis į psichologinių dalykų, bet kai prasideda sujunginėjimas, tada jau galima ginčytis įvairių dalykų. Geopolitiniai dalykai visiškai ne jos sritis ir daug kas jį kritikavo už geopolitinės pažiūras. Mano asmeninė dar nuomonė yra, kad Petersonas po savo lygos ir po tos tokios transformacijos, kai jį daug metų, čia vienas iš klausimų, kur aš norėčiau Petersoną paklausti, labai nuoširdžiai man įdomu būtų. Ar labai ilgą laiką trūkęs tos Left Amerikos visiškas, tragiškas elgesys su Petersonu, kas yra nenuginčiama. Left ir ta bendruomenė elgėsi su Petersonu tragiškai. Visiškai tragiškai. Tai man klausimas jam būtų, ar jisai mano, pavyzdžiui, kad per tiek to laiko viduje kažkur nesibildino tas resentmentas, tiesiog pyktis ir ar jo nepastumė labiau į tą gal radikalią dešinę pusę ir panašiai. Nes paskui žiūrint, kai jis nuėjo Daily Wire ir panašiai, jis atrodo kaip ten, nežinau, blogietis iš kokio animacinio filmuko ten. Ir jo tos pozicijos prasideda ir kaip apie Rusijos Ukrainos karą kalbėjo, viskas tiesiog per leftistai bad prizmę. Netgi Rusų ir Amerikos karas, realiai jisai vieną iš argumentų davė, tos davė pradinius 3, kur visi duodavo, tai 4 jisai išvedė teoriją, kodėl rusai puolė, tai kad gintųsi nuo radikalių Amerikos leftistų. Kas yra Amerikos naratyvas? Tie leftistai Amerikoje ten transgenderizmą siūlo, tai yra skatina ir panašiai, tą LGBT ideologiją ir panašiai, o ruskai mirtas, tai kai mes čia ginamės už tradicinę šeimą, jie tą labai taip transformavo gražiai, kad turėtų tokį, tarsi gynybą, kad čia supuvęs vakarų pasaulis, o mes čia vadginėjai to gerojo pasaulio, žinai, ir panašiai. Kas yra visiškai nesąmonė ir visiškai absurdas. Ir Petersonas toks kaip naudingas idiotas maždaug patapo toj vietoje ir atkartojo maždaug tą naratyvą, bet nemanau, kai jis net pats suvokė, kad tą tokį naratyvą gal kartoja, nes jam tiesiog viskas dabar yra per tiek laiko Amerikos leftistai kalti dėl fucking visko. Ir aš suprantu, kodėl jis gali taip jaustis, nes jį tiesiog su juo tragiškai elgiasi iš tikro. Ir čia yra turbūt pagrindinis argumentas, kad jeigu tu nori kažkieno ar mintis pakeisti, ar kažkokį tokį kultūrinį karą laimėti, tu negali tiesiog iš šuns dienas dėti kiekvieną dieną to žmonių grupės, arba su jais nešnekėti ir tiesiog dalbajobais vadinti kiekvieną dieną, nes tu tiesiog juos radikalizuosi. Ir techniškai tu nepasieki nieko. Ir jo, bet, tai, man atrodo, su Petersonu buvo šitai, bet kaip būtų? Čia Petersonas kalbės apie Izraelį ir Palestiną. Dabar jisai daug savo argumentų, daug savo teiginių tam, kad iliustruotų. Nepagrįstų, tarkim taip skis, nepagrįstų, bet kad iliustruotų savo tos teiginius, kad, jis pagrindžia visokiam istorijom, kurios būna paremtos religijai. Ar ten kokioj Biblijos, kokioj pasakoj. Ir iš tų jis visai nemažai ištraukia tų ir archetipo istorijų, nu, tipo, yra šiek tiek gal ir pagrindimo iš to, bet pagrindė jo visi tie psichologiniai dalykai, nu, didesnį svorį turi jo pagrindimuose teiginių negu religija. Bet jis religinių tų istorijų papasako, aišku, jisai apie religiją išmano daug daugiau negu aš ar kažkas kitas, ten turbūt, nu, tipo, iš čia tai Izraelis, Palestina, gal kažką papasakos, bet jo, pats pokalbis turėtų būti įdomus. Tai čia toks mano papasakojimas, mano pozicija apie Petersoną ir panašiai, bet dabar žiūrim.
Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Jordan Peterson. Jordan, great to have you back on the program. A lot has happened since you were last on just a few weeks ago. I want to start by saying that I'm wrestling with a lot of moral quandaries about this war. And I'm hoping that through our conversation today, we might get to at least have some clarity about the moral quandaries and see if we can work out what we should be thinking about this, because I think it's very complicated and it's got to be nuanced, this conversation. Do you feel any moral quandaries about it?
Well, I don't think you can have a war without moral quandary. I mean, a war is the consequence of an unsolvable moral quandary. And so it's not surprising that the conversation surrounding the war is full of moral quandaries, because if it was straightforward and simple, and if there was an easy path forward, then there wouldn't be a war. And so, I mean, I can tell you what I think is going on to the degree that you can reduce it to something quickly explicable. You know, I think Iran is desperate because of the tenuous hold on power that the mullahs now have in Iran, given their own citizens' rebellion. I think they see the Abraham Accords, which were the most significant step forward towards peace in the Middle East for like 75 years. They see the Abraham Accords as an existential threat. This is a last-ditch attempt.
Pala sekundėlę, Abraham Akordai, kurie buvo bilateral agreements on Arab-Israel normalization signed between Israel and United Arab Emirates September 15, jo, aš tą girdėsiu, 20 metais. United States mediatino, jo, kaip prisiminiau.
By the Iranian mullahs to use the Islam against Jews story to prop up their own dismal reign. And so they rattled the chain of their Hamas puppets and said, provoke, and they did. And their hope is that the Israeli response will be so overwhelming that the Arab world turns against them, and maybe even the people who might be inclined to be swayed by a victim narrative in the West, and that the Abraham Accords will fall apart, and that'll be the end of that. And that could happen, and I'm hoping it won't, because I think the Abraham Accords were, and it's irritating to me.
Ne, į kamerą žiūri, ne iš suflerio skaito, tikrai iš suflerio neskaito, by the way, bet čia, todėl iš žvilgsnio kalbėja, nuotolinių čia jo, tai tiesiog į kamerą žiūri.
Saudi Arabia would have signed the Abraham Accords 2 years ago if Biden would have moved a little bit more forthrightly on it, and I think the reason that he didn't
pakaltinam dar Bideną, kad per lėtai biškuką,
any credit for anything that he had attained in his administration. And I think all of that is appalling. And, I see this story of Muslim against Jew being put forward in this propagandistic manner, and I think, well, the Muslim world has to make a choice too, because it doesn't look to me like their proper champions is the government in Iran, and it's not like the Saudis don't have their flaws, and perhaps the rest of the Arab governmental structures, but the Islam world should move in the direction of the Abraham Accords. That would be great for everyone. We could have a real peace. We could have something approximating a union of the
key points of Abraham Accords. Ar yra koks TLDR? Main points. Yra kažkoks declaration, galima kokį TLDR grinai. We, the undersigned, recognize the importance of maintaining and strengthening peace in the Middle East and around the world based on mutual understanding and coexistence, as well as respecting for human dignity and freedom, including religious freedom. We encourage efforts to promote interfaith and intercultural dialogue to advance a cultural peace among the three Abrahamic religions and all humanity. We believe the best way to address challenges. Gerai, čia tiesiog toks statementas yra tolerance, jo, kad visi nesiradikalizuojam ir draugiškai gyvenam. Okay, bet ar tai, or that was it? Actually, that was it. Tiesiog toks, nu...
Abrahamic people, and I think the accord was named extraordinarily well. Or we could have what we've had for the last 75 years with the Palestinians as perpetual cannon fodder, you know, at the beck and call of those for whom having them be cannon fodder is useful. And so, yeah, well, there's just moral quandaries everywhere there. It's a minefield, but that's what I think is the fundamental reality of the current situation. It's a propaganda war, and there's a lot at stake.
On October the 7th, Hamas obviously committed a terror attack of appalling magnitude. Where were you when you first heard about it, and what was your instant feeling about it?
Well, my instant feeling was to be sickened by it, you know, and it hasn't been that long since I was in Jerusalem, and so it was a little closer to me than it might have otherwise been. I'm also more sensitive to any signs of anti-Semitic catastrophe from studying the Holocaust for the length of time that I did, and I've always regarded Jews as the canary in the coal mine, and I think the reason Jews are the canary in the coal mine is because they're a successful minority. You know, and if a culture can tolerate a successful minority, it's pretty damn robust and it's not very resentful. And as soon as a culture starts to get resentful, the Jews make an easy target because they're a minority, and so that's an easy target to begin with, but then they're the minority that has the temerity to be successful, and that really brings the resentful out of the rat holes. And I've seen a rise in anti-Semitism online over the last 3 years. It's just stunning to behold, on the right and on the left. And then, well, so I was sickened by it, but
nežinau, kiek čia tas argumentas valid, nu, tipo, jo, jaučiu galima valid, bet čia, nu, tas argumentas labai supaprastintai, jie pavydi mums. Čia tie heiteriai jo, bet mums pavydi, nes mes successful, žinai. Instagram'e daug laikų turim ir tie pavydoliai pavydi, tai kai visuomenė gali tą mažumą, tipo, toleruoti, kuris sėkmingai yra, tada visuomenė, tipo, rafinuota. Okay.
And I was also immediately suspicious of Iran's role.
Sėkmingi Instagrameriai čia yra lygų žydai, tipo, šitam pavyzdžiui.
I think it's quite obvious, but that also opens up the rat's nest of the maneuvering, the political maneuvering around the Abraham Accords, because, you know, I was very ill when the Abraham Accords were signed, and I couldn't or hadn't paid much attention, and when I sort of recovered my ability to see again, I saw that this remarkable peace process had taken place, and I could not understand for the life of me why it wasn't trumpeted on the front page of every newspaper across the world. And I also think that Trump's team should have got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. I cannot see how you could possibly make a counter-argument to that, for all of Trump's flaws and for his administration's flaws. This was a major accomplishment. And yet, and I know the Saudis were behind it. You know, they didn't sign it, but it wouldn't have gone forward without their nod and wink. And I believe, that if Biden would have taken the opportunity and been a bit magnanimous in his response to Trump, which he could.
Aš per mažai apie tą žinau, nieko tai apie tą žinau. Žinau, kad aš turiu įtarimą, kad čia nebūtų visai taip, kaip pasakė. Nu, nes jis čia labai jau ir Nobelio taikos premija ir viską, bet palatai nieko nedavedė tas. Tai tipo, ar tikrai tas pasiekimas buvo labai, kaip čia kažkoks geras, gal, nu, tipo, jeigu pasirašė žinodami, kad okay, mes pasirašom, kad paimti savo laiko ir vienintelė priežastis, kodėl mes pasirašom tą, kad galėtum planuoti savo kokią ataką ir panašiai. Bet jau sakau, per mažai žinau. Bet čia jau 3 kartus, žinai, pasakė, Bidenas blogai, nieko nedarė, Trumpas zaibys, nes tą padarom, tipo, nežinau, per mažai žinau. Bet I doubt.
Could have been, instead of thinking of him as Satan himself, that he could have enticed the Saudis into a peace accord. And we wouldn't be in this damn situation now. And now we're playing it out the hard way, you know, because the Iranians...
Čia ne apie Palestiną kalba, bet per ko čia Palestiną? Vat apie ką tu kalbi? Nes nesako, kad Palestina pasirašė, tai jis kalba apie Iraną ir Arabus iš viso čia dabar.
Could win the propaganda war And they've got, God only knows how many agents they have in the West, you know, promoting the kind of social upheaval that we've seen on the streets in the last few weeks. And so the narrative could go either way. But I'm rooting hard for the Abraham Accord signees, and I hope they have the courage of their convictions, and I hope they can see that their way forward is the most appropriate way forward for the good of the Muslim world. Or what, are we going to stay in some 14th century conflict between the fundamentalist Muslim world and the Jews? Jesus, that sounds, you know, we've had enough of that, haven't we?
True.
You'd think.
I asked Ben Shapiro, what is the proportionate response to what happened on October 7th? And he said there isn't one. That there is no proportionate response, and there shouldn't be. I mean, that in itself, you know, I asked Vivek Ramaswamy when I interviewed him at the weekend the same question, and he was basically inferring the same, but he also said.
Argumentas ir klausimas, koks yra proporcinis atsakas. Turbūt jo, neįmanoma taip pasakyti, kad nėra proporcinį atsaką. Nu, tipo, įsivaizduokim situaciją. Jeigu proporcinį atsaką tu darai kiekvieną kartą, kai teroristai, žinai, kažką padaro. Nu, tai tipo, teroristai pasiuntė 5 savižudžius bomberius ir susprogdino, žinai, 1000 žmonių. Tai dabar proporcinis atsakas koks iš tavęs, kad tu nusiųsi 5 ir susprogdinsi 1000 jų. Bet tai gerai, kas būna, jeigu viena šalis, nu, tu turėsi aukoti 5 žmonės, ras savanorius, kurie, nu, tai, aš nežinau, nu, koks būtų. O to šalies religijoje ar panašiai tikėjime, nu, jie patys savanoriauja ekstremistai, kad, tipo, jo, aš noriu eiti, tipo, ar tą daryti, tipo, nu, net neįmanomas proporcionat, nu, ir mes neturėtumėm tada, nu, nes tu tokioje vietoje paskatinti, tu žaidži jų žaidimą, ko jie tada ir nori, nes jie tai pasiruošia, tipo, jiem pohui jų žmonės. Aš noriu, kad mano valstybė būtų pohui žmonės ir taip, jūs tą padarėte, tai mes tą padarysim, ir savo suicide bomberius pasiūsim. Ne, aš nenoriu toj šūdmalystėje gyventi, aš noriu, tipo, geresnį šalį gyventi. Tai tas proporcinis responsas, nu, niekada neįmanomas. Jeigu tu esi teroristas, man atrodo, tu niekad neturėtum sulaukti proporcinio respons, nes čia tada tu enablini terorizmą. Nes jie supranta, kad gaus atsaką. Ir jie nori, kad jisai būtų proporcionat. Jeigu tu padarai tokį proporcingą atsaką teroristui, tu valio, jie to ir norėjo. Norėjo kuo švelnesnio to atsako, o tas proporcinis tai yra toks pat, jiems idealiai veikia. Nes jų tikslas nėra kažkokia, tipo, nu, kaip čia, savo žmonių gyvybės išsaugoti ar kažką, jų niekad tikslas toks nėra. Tai jo, anyway, tai tas, jo, aišku, Ben Shapiro turbūt toliau nueitų su to, nes jis žydas yra, jo, ir panašiai, tai ten jam ne tik, kad nėra proportional response, jis, man atrodo, ten norėtų segniukus užmesti iš karto. Nežinau, gal ir nenorėtų, bet aš tikrai sutikčiau, kad kai teroristai kažką padaro, kažin ar atsakymas yra proporcinis atsakas, proporcionalus atsakas.
That, you know, he would happily put the heads of 100 Hamas leaders on stake.
Ir čia ne apie tai, kad nu, aš nežinau, ar aš turiu pausinti rimtai, nu, ištisai aiškinti. Apie daugą, ir apie taiką, ir apie situaciją, bet, nu, tas karas, tas konfliktas nevyksta vakuume. Arabų šalis ten susijusios yra. Kas padeda organizuoti, viskas susiję. Tai Petersonas nuo ko pradėjo šnekėti, tai būtent nuo tų akordų, kurie buvo žingsnis tom arabų šalim vienytis ir nustoti kariauti ir viens kito tipo nekęs maždaug. Tai jis nuo to pradėjo. Niekas nesako, kad tie akordai buvo grinai tarp Palestinos ir Izraelio taikos sutartis. Ir aš nesuprantu, ar tu negirdi, ar what the fuck, ble. Gerai.
Along the border. As a message to people not to commit this act. I thought that was a sort of medieval barbaric response to medieval barbarism, and that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is not the solution. I also believe that Israel has a fundamental right not just to defend itself after what happened, but has a duty to protect its people, and it has to take that duty obviously very seriously. But if your mission statement, as they've made clear, is to eliminate Hamas completely, and Hamas live in Gaza surrounded by civilians, among civilians,
yes,
you can only do that. You can only get rid of Hamas with massive civilian casualties. And that's where I have this moral quandary about how much is too much.
Well,
does Israel get a license to do whatever it wants to eliminate Hamas, or should there be a limit? And if so, what is that limit?
Well, I don't think Israel will have a license to do whatever it wants, because what will happen, inevitably, I was an Iranian propagandist, I would be counting on this. Let's imagine that Israel moves against Hamas with its usual effectiveness, and they start winning, you know, in a serious way, and the casualties mount. Well, it's a lot easier to take a victim appreciation stance against a power that's clearly winning. So Israel can't win without accruing losses along the way, because more they manifest their military superiority.
Ir čia turbūt buvo tas, kad, nu, kuo smarkiau Izraelis laimi prieš tos jos puolančius, tarkim, panašiai, o jie istoriškai laimėjo ir smarkiai gan laimėdavo, tuo jie daugiau tų priešų susirenka visam pasaulyje, žydai, aš turiu omeny, kur, man atrodo, aš net užvakar tą sakiau, kad ten istoriškai, man atrodo, buvo, kad pradėjo kraustis į tą, nu, į savo Izraelį, tą naują šalį, tipo, whatever, pradžioj, tada juos pradeda pult. Tada jie apsigina ir tada visam pasaulyje likę žydai tampa, nu, kaip čia, nepykantos taikiniu ir jie varo Izraelį, nes ten žydų šalis, tipo. Jų daugiau Izraelį atvaro ir vietiniai žmonės, nu, ten tie palestiniečiai ir whatever, dar labiau nepastenkinę, nes kiek čia gali jų važiuoti vis daugiau ir daugiau. Ir vėl tada koks karas, vėl išpuolis. Tada vėl Izraelis laimi ir toks vat ratas gaunas. Tai čia Petersonas tą iš esmės tik komplikuočiau pasakė gal, kad kuo daugiau Izraelis vis laimi prieš juos, tuo daugiau tų priešų vis susikūrė, nes, nu, jo, gali iš šono atrodyti, kad, nu, čia tokia vat galinga karinė jėga, tiesiog visus daužo, nieks negali pasipriešinti, tai kaip pats, nu, kaip teroras toksai, nu, bet kažkaip pamiršta, žinai, kad ne, tai jos puola, nustokit pult ir viskas, blet.
The easier it's going to be for those who cast the Palestinians as victims to hold, to gain the moral upper hand.
Teisingas argumentas, sakyčiau.
And so, and that doesn't mean I know what Israel should do, because I wish I had that wisdom. But what I would like to see happen, in the best of all possible worlds perhaps, would be for the signees of the Abraham Accords to say to Israel, privately first, we're not budging. And then maybe to take a foray into the public and say that. It would be lovely to see Saudi Arabia come out and say, you know, we're going to continue the Abraham Peace Accord process. And then Israel could say, well, if the Abraham Accord holds and we have the probability of expanding it, we can take the risk of not being so devastating in our response to Hamas, and they could back off. But because there'd be a counter victory in it for them.
Gal neblogiausias pasiūlymas, bet turbūt gan naivus, nes čia, nu, kaip sakė, idealiam pasauliui.
Especially because that would also have the side benefit of not allowing Iran to prevail. So
Nežinau, turbūt realistiškesnis yra tiesiog, kad Amerika turi Izraeliui pasakyti, kad okei, gana viskas, you're done. Man atrodo, čia realistiškesnis negu kad arabų šalis ar kažką pasakys dabar būtent, kad tipo, jo, davai tęsim tos Abraham akordus ir davai čia taikiai dabar. Ne, netikiu, kad taip tipo gali būti, bet I don't know.
That's the best I can do on how this might proceed in the most optimistic possible way. And I don't know if that's good enough or not.
On October the 7th, you tweeted, give them hell, Netanyahu, enough is enough. And you got some blowback for that, as everybody says anything about this. Were you surprised by the scale of the blowback? Do you wish you'd phrased that tweet differently? Do you have any regrets about it?
Well, you know, Twitter is a very complicated social media platform.
Wish you'd phrased that tweet differently? Do you have any regrets about it?
If that's good enough or not.
On October the 7th, you tweeted, give them hell, Netanyahu, enough is enough. And you got some blowback for that, as everybody says anything about this. Were you surprised by the scale of the blowback? Do you wish you'd phrased that tweet differently? Do you have any regrets about it?
Kaip pasakė Snoop Doggas, nah, I meant every word, fuck them hoes. Tas buvo, kur Twitteris yra tiesiog šitokinimo platforma. Ten yra tiesiog platforma, kaip man YouTube'ės komentaruose, tiesiog ventint ant visiškų protiškai atsilikusių degradų. Ten jokios kultūros ar civilizuotos diskusijos, nei platforma tam sukurta, nei ten turi būti, nei to reikia ieškoti. Tai jo, aš sakyčiau, kad čia dabar sakyti, čia plus tas responsas nebuvo, tas tweetas net nebuvo kažko labai ten ypatingas. Tipo, dabar ieškoti, ar tu norėjai kitaip sakyti, ar gailės tą tweetą, fuck you.
You know, Twitter is a very complicated social media platform, and it's been difficult for me to learn how to use it wisely. And I'm not alone in that, because it's difficult to be wise on Twitter. Now, what I'm trying to learn is when a tweet is appropriate and when a long-form commentary is appropriate. And the rule, I think, is something like the higher the stakes, the more likely that the long-form commentary is necessary. And really, it would have been better had I, because I did release a YouTube video where I explained some of what we already talked about.
I saw it,
and that was, well, that was received much better, let's put it that way, but it also gave me a chance to elaborate my argument. And so what it highlighted for me, and I felt, you know, I was look, I was very taken aback by what happened in Israel. And I was also appalled because in my estimation, it was unnecessary. As I said, the Abraham Accords could have been extended earlier, and maybe this wouldn't have been necessary. And so I allowed myself to express some sentiment at that point without providing context. And that wasn't as good as providing the context. And I'm rethinking Twitter overall at the moment about how to use it. You know, Elon has taken off the character limit, and he's also made it possible to distribute video. And so it no longer has to be a place where impulsive exchanges can occur rapidly. And I'm trying.
By the way, I don't know. Kai čia atskira tema, šiandien biškai dar apie tai pagalvojau, nes Discord šnekėjau. Elono Musko visa situacija ir Twitteris, ne? Nu, labai populiaru duhinti Eloną Muską su to Twitteriu. Nu ir iš tikrųjų ten fucked up situacija buvo. Bet kai žmonės nuo pat pradžių sako, kad Elonas Muskas sunaikino Twitterį ir panašiai, nu, ble, Twitteris buvo tragiška platforma, tragiškas pirkinys. Ne veltui Elonas Muskas norėjo ten nepirkti ir pasitraukti iš to jobano dylo. Tai buvo tragiškas ir business modelis, žiauriai nepelningas, žiauriai minusas ir žiauriai overvaluintas. Kaip būna dažnai, praškai visą laiką, man atrodo, su tom, nu, ypatingai didelėm tokiam korporacijom, kurios paremtos attentionu. Kaip, nežinau, ar kas nors žinot, FaZe klanas, kur buvo esporto komanda, nu, bet daugiau negu buvo. Įvertinta milijardų, dabar, man atrodo, 16 milijonų, ir kiek ten ją pardavė ar kažką, nu, ten, tipo, jos visą laiką būna žiauriai pervertintos. Tai dabar Twitteris garantuotai buvo pervertintas. Ir aš nenustepčiau, jeigu Elonas Muskas tą žinojo ir todėl ir norėjo išeiti iš to dylo, nes ten buvo teismai dėl botų ten ir kiek iš tikrų userių yra. Ir kai pamatė ten tos visus financialus, kad ten, nu, neįmanoma taip išlaikyti, Twitteris gyvavo, nu, į visišką minusą. Tai kai atėjo Muskas, kuris jau nusipirko tą Twitterį ir vertė dingo. Nu, visų pirma, jis ne cash'ų mokėjo. Ten, blėt, turtingi milijardieriai, ten tokias varkas tais pinigais, leverage'us suka ir panašiai, nu, tipo, tai skaičiai ir jo, aš, nu, I don't know, aš per mažai nusimanau, kad apie tą kalbėti, nusimanau tik tiek, kad, tipo, varkių sukimas ir panašiai, bet gerai, turi Twitterį, ne? Ir dabar jisai mato ir žino, kad čia yra tragiška platforma. Ir iš tikrųjų, jau ilgą laiką kartoja, kad Twitteris mirė, jau mirė. Dabar tą Elonas Muskas padarė, oi, Twitteris mirė. Ta atleido darbuotojui, už savaitės mirs. Ir Twitteris vis dar yra. Dabar ir toliau ginčiasi, kad tragiška platforma. Ir buvo fucking tragiška platforma, kad userių prarado. Jo, nesiginčiu. Turbūt prarado. Daug kas turbūt išėjo, nes Elonas Muskas nepatinka, bet visai įmanoma, kad ir daug botų ten, pavyzdžiui, užblokavo. Viskas yra įmanoma. Bet techniškai yra įmanoma, kai jis iš to Twitterio, nu, iš X dabar, jeigu plano toliau gyvenins, yra įmanoma, kad padarys dalyką, kuris actually gali būti vieną dieną profitable. O jeigu bus profitable bent milijoną į pliusą, tai jau bus geriau negu kad buvo Twitteris, kuris ten milijardus eina į minusą kasmet. Nu, tai tipo tas, aš nežinau, kaip žmonės, nu, taip gali visiškai, nu, išjungt smegenis, nes Musko nekenčia ir, nu, smagu iš jo dergtis, bet, nu, taip žiūrint situaciją, tai jeigu jis dabar daro tą platform of everything, kad ten video keltų, ten Joe Rogano epizodą nesenai įdėjo, kur, nu, peržiūrų surenka vis tiek ten, kviečia, ten Taylor Swift rašė, kad įdėtų savo muzikinį klipą į tą Twitterį. Nu, tipo, tai daro ir komunikacijų platformą, ir bankinimo platformą, ir ten media platformą, nu, visko platformą, tipo, toks jo planas. Yra įmanoma, kad tas funkcionalumas vieną dieną, nu, jeigu pakankamai gal gerai padarys, actually gali padaryti Twitterį ne toks, koks buvo 5 milijardai evaluation, bet eit į pliusą. Tai tipo, tai jo, aš nežinau, man niekad nepatiko tas, nu, aklas heitas ir duhinimas to Elono Musko, o kai yra tiek dalykų, už ką tikrai galima jį kritikuoti. Kritikuoja apie tokį dalyką, kur turbūt vienintelis teisingas atsakymas yra, nu, jis nusipirko, jis gali daryti, ką nori, I guess, ir let's wait and see. O ne tiesiog, nu, viską, ką jis daro, apšikinėti be jokio suvokimo, kad gerai, gal ir nėra blogas sprendimas. Kai ten apmokestino tos visus checkmarkus verifyintus ir panašiai. Nu, tipo, I get it. Kažkaip bando kažkokią inovaciją, kad kažkaip monetizuota jobana šūdų maišą. Nu, nes jis nebuvo monetizuotas ir į minusą ėjo, tai I get it. Gal vieni sprendimai blogesni, kiti ne, bet, nu, eina, I guess, link to. Tai, anyway, gerai. Toliau čia. Trumpas buvo rantas.
I'm much happier with the video. Now, you know, I was upset because I had developed somewhat of a Muslim following on YouTube, and I was very happy about that. A lot of people on the Islamic side of the world were watching my biblical lectures, for example, and you know, and I've had extensive conversations with Muslims on my YouTube channel, and you know, I burnt some of that up.
Aš nežinau dar plus, aš tiesiog nepirksiu, aš Teslos nepirksiu pelno šūdus į Ukrainą. Nu, aš visų pirma Teslos neperku, nes neturiu nei teisių, nei pinigų, kad Teslą pirkt, bet kiek toli mes turėtumėm prisiminėti pozicijas, kad aš nepirksiu produkto, nes ta korporacija kažką politiškai tūpo pasakė ar padarė. Man atrodo, kad čia toks biškai būna labai dažnai dalbajobiškas požiūris. Nes tu tada literaliai nieko negali pirkti. Tu tada negali pirkti telefono jokio iš jokios kompanijos, nes jie padarė galbūt tokio pačio lygio blogybės, tipo ten vaikus įdarbina kobolto farmose ten, kad tą telefoną pastatytų. Nu, tipo, tai kai tu taip pradedi vertinti ir boikotuoti, tu realiai tada, nu, tu tampi, automatiškai hipokritų tampi. Nes visi laiką kažką galėsim prisikasti ir rasti, kur tu neturėtum tada pirkti, bet vis tiek perki ir naudoji. Nu, žodžiu, anyway, okay, žiūrim.
And I'm not sure I did that. Well, I would say I'm certain I didn't do that in the most productive manner. And so, do I regret it? It would have been better to do the long form, to have done the long form to begin with, you know? And Twitter invites and rewards a certain amount of impulsivity, and it wasn't...
True.
I don't know, Piers, I don't know if it's ever time for impulsive action, especially when the stakes are serious, you know?
Yeah,
and so,
I completely get that. I mean, there's no doubt, for example, that what happened on October the 7th was a form of hell for the victims and for their families. There's also no doubt that for many living in Gaza, for many innocent Palestinians, it's, as we know, of the 2 million or so residents and citizens there, they, I think it's more than half are of child age, and many are very young children, and many children are getting killed. And as a father, I'm sure as like me, as a father, it is utterly heartbreaking to see so many thousands of children being killed who have nothing obviously to do with this. Again, this comes back to this moral quandary I have. You know, it's interesting when you said enough is enough in that tweet. You know, some people are already saying, even if they're very sympathetic to Israel's need to take out Hamas, they're looking at these fairly apocalyptic scenes in Gaza and thinking, enough is enough of that. You know, in other words, the revenge is already far greater in terms of death toll than the original appalling terror attacks. That, again, is where I have a moral quandary.
Well, the question is, I suppose, and I don't purport to have an answer to this, is the most effective way of combating Hamas military? And part of the answer to that is the military eradication of Hamas even possible? Because as I said, and we can see it unfolding in real time, as Israel is more successful militarily and the casualties mount, the resistance to what they're doing is going to grow.
Yeah.
And so even if they could take out Hamas militarily, which isn't obvious given its interpenetration with the civilian population, all of what's going to be played out is going to be played out on the military front. And we can see that in the rising tide, let's say, of demonstrations around the Western world. And I would say those demonstrations are likely to get larger and more effective in precise proportion to Israel's success on the military side. And so then I would think, well, is there another way of restraining Hamas? And, well, that brings us back to the Abraham Accords, because they were the most promising thing that's happened in 7 decades. You know, and I think it's easy to underestimate.
O yra jau Tesla services LT, jo jis vadinas tavo mama.
Estimate what a miracle they were. The people who formulated the Abraham Accords had to fight the State Department. They tried to introduce it under Obama to begin with, right? The notion was, well, maybe we could start the peace process with Israel without putting the Palestinians first. And that had been off the table conceptually in the State Department, as far as I've been informed, forever. And then it was proposed during the Obama era, and it was rejected. And then it was proposed during the beginning of the Trump era and rejected, but eventually they carried the day. And then they did do an end run. And I think that actually put I think that was actually good for the typical Palestinian, because it put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Palestinian authorities, who are basically tyrants who are more than willing to use their own citizens as cannon fodder. It put a lot of pressure on them to actually do something moving towards a genuine peace, which is why now Iran, that's why Iran is so desperate to scuttling accords, I think.
Of course.
You know? So I think the way through Hamas, all things considered in the medium to long run, is to desperately extend the Abraham Accords as rapidly as possible. That's not a military victory, but you know, it's easy to do this from the armchair.
When you look at the full history of this conflict, the 7 decades of conflict between Israel and Palestine, Jonathan Friedland is a very good, respected Jewish journalist for The Guardian in the UK. He wrote a very interesting column the other day saying, you know, you could argue that both sides have a just cause here. And he said that as a leading Jewish commentator, that historically both sides have a just cause, and that it's important to remember that, and that's why passions run so high. It's why people care so much, and it's why racing to take sides is a mistake in this conflict. What do you think of that?
Well, I think...
Tipo, galima gal sakyti, nu, vėlgi, kiek aš nusimanau, patys žinot, tipo, nedaug, bet kiek aš girdėjau, kaip aš mąstau, kad kol galima daryti argumentą, kad greičiausiai abi pusės turi kažkokį argumentą. Man atrodo, Izraelio yra daug stipresnis. Man atrodo, Palestina turi daug mažesnį klaimą ir Italiją, Jeruzalę tą pačią, arba ten į tą žemės, ar dar kažką. Ir kol galim mes pritemti turbūt viską, ir čia gal mažai net reiktų pritemti, kad kažkokį tą klaimą turėti. Man atrodo, Izraelis turi daug stipresnį klaimą į tas teritorijas, ir ypač, kai Izraelis nori tiesiog egzistuoti ir nieko fucking nepuldinėja, nu, tipo, nenaikina konstituciją ten savo, toj bent jau pradiniai, kur ten Hamas ten rašo Palestinos, ten tie, kad, tipo, naikint kitą tautą reikia, nu, tipo, man atrodo, jeigu mes taip žiūrim, nu, ir visų pirma, jiem davė tą žemės po antro pasaulinio ir nežinau, man atrodo, jie turi daug stipresnį klaimą, negu ten žiūrėti 1000 metų kažkas kažkur iš kažkokios knygos išvartymo religinės ten ar dar kažką, man tas argumentas tiesiog niekur nelabai tinka.
That, you know, if there wasn't a lot to be said on both sides, then the conflict wouldn't drag on forever and be unresolvable. You know, I think at some point you do something like cut the Gordian knot, which I do think to some degree the Abraham Accords had begun to do.
Gordian knot. Čia bus vienas iš tų kaip Sizifo akmonė. The cutting of a Gordian knot is an ancient Greek legend associated with Alexander the Great in Gordium, regarding a complex knot that tied an ox cart. Reputedly, whoever could untie it would be destined to rule all of Asia. It is used as a metaphor for a seemingly intractable problem, which is solved by exercising an unexpectedly direct, novel, rule-bending, decisive, and simple approach that removes the perceived constraints. Oh, okay. Okay.
No, I don't think Israel's going away. But I don't think the Palestine isn't going away either. And so those things have to be accepted. It looks to me like they have to be accepted as on-the-ground realities. Now, the problem I've seen continually, I don't know, is that it's been convenient to use the Palestinians as an irritant to Israel in the West. And so the Palestinians have been held hostage. You know, the people who portray them as innocent victims presume that the Palestinians have been held hostage by the Jews, let's say. But I would say the Palestinians have been held hostage even more effectively by their own leadership and by willing to use them as the expendable front man to irritate Israel in the West. Well, you can't get peace under those circumstances. You know, and so...
True.
Palestine is a reality that isn't going to go away, and Israel's a reality that isn't going to go away, and the Abraham Accords started to recognize that, and there was move in the right direction, and if that falls apart, we're going to be back to where we were 15 years ago, except worse.
The interesting moment for me came when Israel turned off the power and the water. They just were able to do that to 2 million people in Gaza. They could turn off the internet. And it struck me that that was a very vivid...
Amerikiečiai tada sustabdė juos. Amerikiečiai kažkaip pasakė, kad ne, turite jungti atgal internetą ir kažką, ar ne?
For many young people in Gaza, they know this, and they do feel that they've been living in a perpetual prison camp, where their movement is controlled, where their access to basic things like water and energy and so on is controlled.
Ne, čia neįmanoma, kad tai būtų sustainable.
They get the freedom that they crave, this can never get resolved.
Well,
but I also understand on the other side that the Israelis feel, how can we give freedom to a place that is run by a terror group who are literally committed to the eradication of not only Israel, but all Jewish people?
Well, you laid out what are the two sets of valid counterclaims. I mean, there's another complicating factor too. You know, you said that your moral back is up because of the continual toll in civilians in Palestine, especially among people who, let's say, weren't even born when they first came to power. And so it's very difficult to look at that and see it as anything but unjust. But then it begs a whole other set of questions too, doesn't it? It's like, well, if your government is a totalitarian band of armed criminal thugs, what responsibility do you bear for that as
Tokie kaip Landsbergis ir Šimonytė.
And it's not like I know the answer to that, but I see in my own country in Canada that things are slipping and sliding in all sorts of pathological directions, and people are letting it happen. And if you let that happen long enough, well, things get very, very bad, and they have got very, very bad in Palestine. And the answer to whatever tyranny Israel might be exerting over the Palestinians isn't for the Palestinians to exert even more tyranny over themselves, especially not in concert with a third party like Iran, who's perfectly willing to sacrifice them at any point. And so now, and then that question emerges, well, what responsibility do the Palestinians bear? Well, then I think we start to touch on more metaphysical issues. It's like, well, the Palestinians, like all people, bear the responsibility to live in truth and to stand up to tyranny in their deeds, their attention and their deeds and their actions. Because if you don't, you pay for that, and so do your children, right? And then so do your grandchildren, and so do your great-grandchildren. And there seems to be something unjust in that why did the children suffer? And the biblical answer to that has always been, well, the children suffer for the sins of their forefathers. And you might think, well, it's pretty unfair that the world is set up that way. It's like, hey, it might be unfair, but it is set up that way, and it does beg the question. What responsibility do the people who are living under the thumb of totalitarians have for the fact that they're living under the thumb of totalitarians? And the answer isn't none. So this is why I'm a psychologist, not a politician. I
think it's a really interesting question. It's also an interesting question. Why
Peterson's gana adekvačiai, manau, čia kalba, būdų jam atrodo gana adekvačiai čia kalba.
Palestinian refugees. I mean, these are legitimate questions.
Right. Well, there's a lot.
Šitoj situacijai, vėlgi, aš paminėsiu dar kartą, jau esu minėjęs. Šitoj situacijai daugam yra daug lengviau būti gan racionaliai žmonėm, kurie gali neprisimti labai griežtų pozicijų ir iš abiejų pusių tiesiog pažiūrėti. Ukrainos rusų kare taip negalėjo nei vieni kiti padaryti, bent jau, gal Piersas, bet Jordanas ne, nes biškai labiau susijęs su jais, gal ir jų politika, ir su Amerika galų gale. Šitas konfliktas, kol su Amerika yra susijęs, ten, žinai, arabai, kiti vieni kitų žudo, taip pat toli yra labiau. Ir tu, aišku, situacija daug labiau komplikuota, bet nėra tokio gal emocinio, nežinau, tokio prisirišimo ir mėginimo, tipo, iš ko matom tos emocinius dalykus, tai iš tų, aišku, izraeliečių, palestiniečių, kurių ten irgi visam pasaulyje, tie žmonės, kuriuos liečia, tai jie žiauriai radikaliai pasisako. Ten, kaip ir pas mus Lietuvotas Lupšicas, whatever, kur, ten absurdiškai radikaliai pasako, ten jokio niuansų, jokios minties, net nėra objektyviai vertinti situaciją. Bet tipo, kad Petersonas su Piersu Morganu gali kažkiek, tipo, iš visų pusių pažiūrėti, aptarti, o tuo tarpu gal Ukrainos Rusijos situacijų negalėjo, tai, taip yra gan įdomiai, bet turbūt natūralu, kad kuo tas konfliktas labiau susijęs ar su mumis, ar su mūsų ideologija gal, arba gal net kiek ideologija, kurioje tu egzistuoji, kiek pasiema tą kažkokį konfliktą kaip įrankį savo naratyvams stumt. Pavyzdžiui, kai rusai pasiema naratyvą LGBT stumt. Niekas turbūt apie LGBT nebūtų daug šnekės ar apie trans žmonės. Jeigu tai nebūtų tapę tiesiog visiškų centrų tam tikros propagandos ar naratyvo. Lietuvoje iš tų mūsų visų šeimamaršių ten ir panašiai, iš tų kitaip mąstančių, Minedas yra pas juos super žvaigždė. Aš nesu matęs, kad jie nors vieną komentarą parašytų be paminėjimo ar Minedo, ar panašiai. Kas mano planetoje net neegzistuoja. Aš nieko apie ten nežinau, vapšė, kas ten gali tą žmogų sekti iš viso. Bet kadangi tas dalykas yra pavirtęs tokiu esminių jų ideologinių tokių įrankių ginklų, jie non-stop apie tai šnekės. Jeigu kažkam netas pasako, niekam nerūpi. Bet jiem, aišku, neįtikėtinai rūpi. Neįtikėtinai rūpi viskas, nes tai yra ginklas, jiem aktualus. Tai čia toks sutapatinimas, ką žmonės gali kažkiek objektyviai ir nešališkai pažiūrėti niuansuotai, į ką tiesiog negali. Ir kai kurios temos būna jų ideologijoje paverstos į įrankius ar ginklus, ir tada tu niekada nesulauksi tokio gan racionalaus pokalbio iš įvairių pusių, žinai, tokio neemocionalaus net ir panašiai. Anyway, gerai, žiūrim toliau.
A lot of chain and saber rattling about how tyrannical Israel is, and of course they're held to a very high moral standard, but the prison that is Palestine has walls on sides that aren't Israeli. So, and that no one, certainly not the progressives, will never talk about that, and that's partly because all the oppressed people are equally morally virtuous, and so the fact that the Arabs won't take in the Palestinians, you can't even bring that up because of course the Arabs themselves are victims of Western colonialism, which is one of the most absurd propositions ever set forth by anyone about anything, but here we are.
Lekstučio argumentas, kad viskas yra vakarų kolonija.
The multidimensional fact of Palestinian enslavement isn't discussed in a much more forthright manner. There's many people are building the walls that make Palestine into whatever prison it is. And perhaps the Israelis are playing their role, but they're by no means the only actors.
Let's talk about the response of progressives, and in particular student campuses, particularly in America. I've been struck by...
Gerai, čia bus Jordanui gera proga užstumtant jobanų leftistų. Ir aš net negalėsiu daug ginčytis, nes didelė dalis leftistų tragiškai Palestiną teisina ir ten tai... Okay, let's go.
One, the horrifying immediate response, not just in America, but when you saw mobs in Sydney, Australia, chanting "Gas the Jews," when you saw huge protests by the Israeli embassy in Kensington in West London, near where I live, all celebrating. This is all within hours of what happened on October the 7th. You saw similar scenes in America. So the gut reaction of many young people appeared to be celebrating what had happened. And you even had there was a Cornell professor who was heard in public saying how exhilarated he was by what happened, and still hasn't been fired. And these are people who've driven this cancel culture for many years now, where if you use the wrong pronoun, they want you eradicated, fired, shamed, abused, and so on. But here, if you celebrate the actions of a terrorist organization in killing 1,500 people, you actually don't lose your job. Students who beamed pro-Hamas rhetoric onto the building at George Washington University, they haven't lost their places at that university. So
True.
The most heinous possible thing that you could do which might warrant cancellation, the people who've driven cancel culture spare themselves.
Well, this shows you how shallow the oppressor narrative really is. Oppressor narrative really is. George Orwell famously said that the typical middle-class socialist didn't love the poor, they just hated the rich. And I think the oppressed narrative gives people moral license to identify the oppressor and to hate them resentfully with a good conscience. Plus, it's also extremely simple-minded, and this is one of the problems with what's being taught in universities, and even much more broadly than that now. The notion is we can view all human social relations and the past itself through a meta-Marxist narrative that proclaims that there are only oppressors and victims, and that all you have to do to be moral is to be on the side of the victim. Now, the shadow side of that is that once you proclaim your moral superiority and you're on the side of the victim, well, number one, you don't have to think anymore. You just have to identify the two sets of players. And number two, you're moral without effort because all you have to do is feel sorry for the victims. And then consequence number three is the oppressor, being intrinsically evil, can be the target of everything that's resentful and bitter and absolutely dreadful about you. Now, that's the standard narrative that's being taught on university campuses, and the Palestinians play the role of victim. And so you can't argue against the Palestinian cause, let's say, if you were inclined to, without simultaneously having to face the weight of every single person who's adopted the oppressor-oppressed narrative, upending that, and there's no way the university, not in the state they're in now, there's no way that's going to fly. And so we see exactly what happened. The narrative's already in place. All oppressed people are innocent and virtuous victims. Well, so then when something like this happens and you see the Palestinian victims rise up against their evil Jewish overlords, then it's time for celebration. You know, and we forget entirely that the evil Jewish overlord story was the same story that the Germans used so successfully. And we also forget, and this is very interesting in relationship to Iran, I was reading a book by Stefan Zweig yesterday about turn-of-the-century Vienna, just at the end of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the dawning of the movements that eventually morphed into Nazism in Germany. And one of the things Zweig pointed out was that, you know, if you're a corrupt, oppressing psychopath who's hell-bent on exploiting the population, and you want to deflect that, the Jews make a constant, positive, universal target, right? Because they tend to be disproportionately successful. And you can just say, well, you know, I'm not the oppressor here. It's those successful Jews. And that's being played out now. That's the disguise of left-wing anti-Semitism.
I mean, it's a terrifying...
We don't hate the Jews, we just love their enemies.
Right, I mean, the anti-Semitic response in the last 3 weeks has been actually quite terrifying to watch. I've got Jewish friends who are literally living in real fear now. Some of whom were in Israel at the time and thought, well, the world will rally behind us. And actually very quickly...
Aš tik pasinaudosiu dar labai trumpai progą užpausinti, pasakyti dar kartelį, tą kartojau labai daug laiko. Kaip yra zaibys Lietuvoje gyventi? Just saying. Tiesiog kaip tą paliksiu. Nesam tobuli, nesam idealus. Bet my fucking god, kiek mes šūdų neturim, kur turi kitos šalis. Holy fuck. Tiesiog, kiekvieni metai eina ir vis daugiau ir daugiau priežasčių aš randu, kodėl Lietuvoje yra tiesiog zaibys gyventi. Mūsų didžiausia problema sezone kartais būna, kad kažkas čekiukus išrašė neteisingus. Mūsų didžiausia problema kitam sezone būna, kad šildymą vėlavo 3 dienas įjungti. Mūsų didžiausia drama dažnai būna, kad Gražuliui apkaltą daro dėl jo 100 000 pasisakymo prieš gėjus. Nu, tipo, ne etninis valymas, ne šventasis karas prieš žydus ar arabus, ne invazija, tipo, holy shit, kaip mes čia gerai ramiai gyvenam, tipo... Ir ekonomika, tipo, gerėja, tipo, rodikliai, kai kurie prastesni gal nėra idealūs, bet, tipo, techniškai didžioji dauguma rodiklių Lietuvoje gerėja su laiku, šalis auga, galimybių vis daug, tipo, holy shit, net nesinori judint. Kai tu pradedi lyginti su kitom šalim, tipo, net nesinori judint Lietuvos, tu daryk, ką darai. Čia yra labai gerai gyventi, gerai, sorry, viskas, pauzė tokia. You
realise that in many cases that wasn't the case, in fact the complete opposite. And when you saw these scenes in Dagestan at the airport with a mob literally charging around trying to find any Jewish passengers they could find. And it was, I mean, horrendous, but...
Ne, pas mus problema yra didesnė, kad yra žmonių, kuriem kokos nesiesta patinka. Čia yra didesnė problema.
If you're Jewish, this is utterly terrifying and must take you right back to Nazi Germany, World War II, the Holocaust. This never again, it is beginning to happen again.
Well, I think we could be heartened in that regard by the counter position, though, too. I mean, I would say the reasonable majority in the Western world didn't take that stance still, and quite forthrightly. I mean, even my Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who virtually never says a true word in his life or makes a his actions are concatenations of false gestures even. You know, he came out with a pretty forthright statement decrying what had happened on the Hamas side. And that has characterized the leadership of the West in general. And so I can certainly understand why the tiny minority of Jews that do exist in the world are terrified about what's happening. You know, there's no reason for catastrophic alarm. You know what I mean? It doesn't look to me like this is going to spiral out of control. And I'm not even so certain that in the medium to long run it's going to be the worst possible thing. Because you know, too, the other thing that happened is that a lot of the false moral disguise of the progressive types was exposed in a radical way in the last few weeks. I mean, Harvard, for example, just took a beating. You know, I mean, first of all, Harvard was ranked dead last by fire in terms of its support for free speech. And then it was 32 different Harvard groups came out essentially in support of Hamas. Yeah. And then a whole variety of CEOs said they wouldn't accept a Harvard degree as a hiring criteria. And Larry Summers came out and said, you know, the previous president of Harvard, that the institution had become so corrupt that it wasn't salvageable. And then, you know, the White House press secretary decried the actions of the squad who were supporting the Hamas protests. You know, so we're seeing cracks on the progressive side because because of this that haven't been evident before. You know, and Biden himself came out and talked about how important it was to push forward with the Abraham Accords, which was something, you know, I wish he would have done 2 years ago, but better.
Ketvirtą kartą tą pasakė,
I understand why there's tremendous fear.
Kad per vėlai Bidenas su gerų dalykų buvo. Man labai patinka kritika dabartinės valdžios, kai tavo kritika yra ne tai, kad jie kažką blogai padarė, o per vėlai padarė. Kad, tipo, nu, reikėjo jau vakar padaryti, jau, nu, tą zaibis, tipo, kad padarė, nu, tu nepasakai, kad gerai, kad padarė, pasakai, kad tai buvo geriausias dalykas, kokį įmanoma padaryti. Nu, bet, nu, nekredituoji, kad gerai padarė, bet per vėlai. Reikėjo 2 mėnesiais anksčiau, 2 metais anksčiau, nes, nu, tipo, niekaip negalėjo Majauskas, niekaip, tipo, negalėjo. Ir jis jau 4 kartą. Bidenas, tipo, nu, geras dalykas, nu, bet reikėjo anksčiau, nu, tai, tipo, you can't win. Jeigu netgi tokią kritiką mes visą laiką turėsim, kad, nu, reikėjo anksčiau, tipo, nu, kaip sen.
Let's talk about social media for a moment. There's no doubt that the kind of tribalism that we see in modern society, fueled by social media, has probably never been worse than I've seen it in the last 3 weeks. A constant barrage of often completely fake imagery, videos, claims, counterclaims from both sides. But it's just a barrage. You know, I've been really quite shocked by just the scale of it and how little of it appears to even have a semblance of truth about it. What do we do about this?
Oh, well, that highlights a very pronounced danger. So, you know, in the last 15 years, we've erected virtual perceptual systems and virtual systems of representing reality. Now, if your system of representing reality is not in accord with reality.
Jis apie šitą kalbėjo savo pokalbį, by the way, Vilniuje, tas, kur buvo. Apie, man atrodo, čia buvo atsakymas į vieną klausimą, nu, ne jo pokalbio, ne lecture dalis, bet tipo atsakymas į Q&A, man atrodo, buvo. Kuris kalbėjo apie tą virtualią, jo, apie Facebooką, kaip paklausė, ir man atrodo technologiją šiaip, jis kalbėjo apie tą virtualų ir nevirtualų pasaulį ir, tipo, kai virtualus pasaulis visiškai netitinka realybės, kaip, pavyzdžiui, jis davė pavyzdį, kai virtualiam pasaulyje, jeigu tu paskaitysi, ar, nu, apie Petersoną, tą Jordaną, nu, jis ten velnio palikuonis tiesiog, bet, nu, realiam gyvenime, nu, tai neegzistuoja, tipo. Eina jisai bendrauja su žmonėm, nu, visiškai kitas interactionas. Nu, kas realiai visą laiką buvo. Nu, tipo, ir aš, tipo, nuvarai ten Game On ar whatever, nu, visi fucking draugiškai. Ten vaikai visi pagarbus iki neįtikėtino lygio. Labą dieną, gal galima nuotrauką, labai ačiū. Ten internete žais normalų supportą, dalbajo, bet pisau tavo mamą. Nu, tipo, okei, sen, nu, tipo, jo, nu, tas, manau, visi pritars, kad, tipo, internetas neatspindi realybės.
You're delusional. And right, technically, that's what a delusion is. And you're going to run into trouble when you try to act in your fantasy and run into the world. Well, these virtual worlds that we've erected on top of the real world don't run by the same principles as the real world. And that makes them delusional. And that delusional element is affecting us very badly in a couple of ways. I just heard Jonathan Haidt this morning talk about some of the research he's reviewing in his new book. He shows very clearly that young liberal women, the probability that a young liberal woman who saturates her life with social media has a mental illness is more than 50%. That's how bad it's got. Yeah, it's really bad. But that's not the only thing that's going on. You see, the other thing I've been watching, and this is really quite frightening to me, is that the problem with one of the problems with online communication is it disinhibits the narcissists and the psychopaths.
Jo, jis apie tą šnekėjo, kad toje erdvėje psichopatai praivina.
Face-to-face interaction.
Yes.
You know, in face-to-face interaction, there's things you will not say or do because you will be held responsible, and maybe immediately. You can say whatever the hell you want online, and you can get away with it too, and maybe even be rewarded for it. And so,
čia senas geras rajone, jeigu pasakydavai, nu, toj kartoj, kai užaugai, jeigu tipo lauke pasakysi ant kažko kažką, gausi snukį. Ir viskas labai greitai, nu, pakoreguos tavo elgesį, kaip sakant, nu, socialiai. Online ne, tai tipo ir paskui ten būdavo, kad, nu, jo, su pisulane.
So you just think about
kas yra teisybė, realiai, ta atsakomybė tokia yra visai kitos gyvenimas bendrai gyvai tai yra.
It isn't nice guys that are running that. Let's put it that way. There's an immense amount of online criminality.
Netgi ne gyvai, o balsu. Aš dabar mėginu prisiminti, kas ar ne Riotas, ar kažkas iš tų geimų kompanijų, žaidimų kompanijų darė tyrimą į elgesį žmonių. Ir tipo, necituokit mes, aš galiu sumaišyti, kas čia tą darė. Nu, bet esmė buvo tas radimas toks, nu, patvirtinimas radimas, kad žmogus gali būti toksik labai whatever, bet balsu yra daug kartų žmogui sunkiau būti, nu, mean. tipo, piktai kažką sakyti ar stumti. Nesvarbu, kad net nemato tavęs, ar tu niekad nepamatysi, nu, anonimas esi techniškai. Bet vien tai, kad tu balsu sakai, nu, daug kartų dadeda žmogui, nu, to tokio stabdžio, ką jis sakys, kaip jisai elgsis ir panašiai. Kas yra visiškai teisybė. Todėl aš, nu, viena iš priežasčių, kodėl aš irgi, tipo, pradeda knis protą ten, iškart, nu, jie gerai nori kalbėti, kalbėsim balsu. Nes aš žinau, kad jie net neš tokios energijos balsu. Nei vienas iš jų net neš tokios energijos balsu. Jeigu atneš, tada, nu, fine. Ok, aš turėsiu progą pasikoliuoti. Bet, tipo, nieks neteina taip balsu nekalba. Never. Ir aš pats, tipo, kai man kažką parašo, atsakau, nu, jūs žinot, kaip aš atsakau. Jeigu kažką pasako, to aš gal atsakysiu grubiau, bet ne taip, kaip atrašant, nes tiesiog taip žmogaus smegenys veikia, pasirodo. Which is, realybė tokia.
Most people are targeted by online criminals on a pretty regular basis. And then we just have the run-of-the-mill narcissistic psychopaths who generate anonymous troll demon accounts who are spreading misery and sadistic hate as fast as they possibly can. And there's no barriers whatsoever to them doing that. And so then when something does happen that's contentious, let's say, the sadistic psychopaths just make hay out of that, right? They're spreading their misery as rapidly as they possibly can for the lulls and the lulzes and to the
grinai, taip atsakau, taip. Let's go with that. Sure.
Are naive enough not to regulate that.
Nieko blogiau nesu parašęs.
Regulating is difficult, but it's a conversation we have to have, Piers, because I think, like, if we let the psychopaths, that's 4% of the population, whenever they get the upper hand, and that happens from time to time, everything burns.
I also think that young people in particular, they are exposed to such relentless dopamine imagery, both still pictures, videos, whatever. And in particular, the last 3 weeks, if you're a young person with an impressionable mind and you're getting bombarded with some of the worst imagery imaginable, you know, babies dead, limbless and so on. If you're getting that on your feed all day long, which I'm seeing on mine, so they must be, it can only have an incredibly damaging effect to I think a young generation already.
Mano buvus draugė turi draugę psichologę, kur jinai pasakoja apie tą pasąmonės įtaką visokiems vaizdams, tiems, nu, ten karo vaizdams ir panašiai, kad, nu, jin tą domėjos to dalykų, kad techniškai, jeigu tau nereikia žiūrėti, tu netgi gali sakyti, kad, tipo, nu, įtakos nedaro ten ypatingos ar panašiai, bet realiai daro. Pasąmonėje žmogaus kenkia realiai tie visokie vaizdai. Ir, nu, turbūt nėra labai kontroversiška nuomonė, bet realiai ten karo visokie vaizdai, ten kaip ten žmonės, nežinau, granatą savo ten praryja, nu, tipo. Bet, tipo, jie techniškai pasąmonėje visas tas fiksuojas. Ir, nu, realiai kuo daugiau, realiai jo vis, kasmet turbūt vis daugiau ir daugiau aš suprantu, kad pasąmonė iš tikrųjų neįtikėtinas dalykas yra. Kiek mūsų pasąmonė dirba ir kiek jinai visko daro ir kiek įtakoja mūsų sprendimus ir elgesį, kur mes net sąmoningai nesuprantam, man vis labiau ir labiau patinka ta Jungo eilutė, jo, kur ta citata, kur aš jau citavau prieš daug metų, bet dabar dar labiau. Kol pasąmoninga netap sąmoninga, kaip ten buvo? Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Jo, kol pasąmoninga netampa sąmoninga, tu tai vadini, tai kontroliuoja tavo gyvenimą ir tu tai vadini likimu, tipo. Kol tu su psichologu pagalba ar whatever neišsiaiškini, kas yra tavo pasąmonė ir kaip vienas ar kitas sprendimas, iš kur jis atėjo, o jie ateina iš pasąmonės didelių atvejų padarytų sprendimų, tol tarsi tave kontroliuoja, tavo sprendimus kontroliuoja ir tu neturi realiai tam gero paaiškinimo ir tada vadini likimu vos ne. Nu, lemtis tokia, tipo. O realiai tai yra pasąmonė, tipo, okei. Tėlį žiūriu gor, nejaučiu kažkokio labai poveikio. Nu, tipo, that's kind of the point, kad, tipo, nieks nejaučia poveikio, nes, nu, tai yra pasąmonė. Bet realiai vyksta poveikis. Kaip ir propaganda lygiai taip pat veikia, kad tu gali puikiai suprasti, kad Delfi praverčiant, antraštės pražiūrint, kad čia nėra geras šaltinis. Ir kad tu nieko ten informacijos labai daug nepasiimsi. Tu puikiai supranti tą racionaliai. Pasąmonė kita vertus nesupranta to racionaliai. Jinai fiksuoja visas tas antraštės, jinai fiksuoja subtilų sentimentą, kuris transliuojamas yra. Paskui tas sentimentas kažkurio atveju padeda suformuoti arba suformuoja nuomonę tam tikrų klausimų. Ir net nežinai iš tikrųjų, kodėl linksti vieną arba į kitą pusę. Nes visas tas buvo atlikta pasąmonėje. Iš labai daug skirtingų dalykų per 5 paskutinius metus surinkta pasąmonės, kur tu gali net pamiršęs jau būt, kad tu ten skaitei kažkokias antraštės ar kažkokį tragišką šaltinį ar panašiai. Tai tipo, jo, pasąmonė viską renka, jinai viską daro ir kartais, jo, pasakymas tas, kad neatrodo, va, tas ir yra the point. Okay, Jesus fucking Christ, okay. Žiūrim toliau. Aš šitą video labai daug interpų darau, visokių lyrinių nukreipimų, bet it's fine, I guess. React content, dadedu turiniu.
You would not be able to access this kind of thing. You were protected in a way from the reality of things like warfare and protected from this kind of imagery.
Yeah, well, again, it's a problem of technological revolution because this new sensory system that we've produced, this new system of perception, it's a fire hose, first of all, that's impossible to govern. You can never get on top of it. It's infinite in its scope.
Yeah.
And then it allows the pathological and the terrible to spread as rapidly as the beneficial and the good. And so it is overwhelming. It's not just kids that have a hard time with that. I mean, it's just these technologies, well, what do we expect? They're insanely powerful and remarkable.
True.
But they carry with it they carry with it all of the implications of that insane power on the pathological side. And we don't exactly know how to deal with it. We don't know how to regulate. We haven't evolved the social norms even that regulate online conduct. You know, I mean, when I block people on Twitter, let's say I have qualms about it, you know, well, I'm in favor of free speech. Do I block trolls online? And when exactly do I block them? You know, I've got more direct about that. I have a couple of rules. You know, if you're anonymous and you're annoying, it's like, you're done as far as I'm concerned. But that's just the beginnings of the evolution of anything approximating social norms.
Aren't you just saying, I mean, I've wrestled with that because I've blocked, I think, 11,000 people or whatever it is. I can't remember what the latest tally is. I go on little block spurges sometimes. But to me, there's no contradiction between believing passionately in free speech, but also allowing yourself not to have to listen to it. You don't have to listen to what people are saying to you.
Well,
you have the right in a free democratic society to say, look, you're entitled to say whatever you want, but I don't actually have to listen to it. You're not preventing them from exercising their right to free speech. You're just saying, I don't want to hear it.
Well, that's why we have walls. Like that's a good example of the difference between the virtual world and the real world. I mean, you have a house and it has walls and a door, and the reason for that is you don't want a random stranger to come in and just yell things whenever. You know, and so what are the walls? Well, we have no idea because we thought, well, we'll democratize the public square. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that any narcissistic psychopath anywhere can say whatever they want to you and everyone you know. Well, you know, that's just not going to work. There's always been criminals and quasi-criminals and troublemakers, and we have some mechanisms of regulation in the actual world and virtually no mechanisms of regulation whatsoever in the virtual world. And so, yeah, it's a tremendous problem. And it is also making it more and more difficult for us to distinguish what's real from what's not real, because you don't know when you're being played for a, what would you call, masochistic fool by a sadistic psychopath. And the answer to that is often.
Yeah.
You know, frighteningly often. And so my sense, like I've proposed this before, is like I think social media enterprises above a certain size should separate people with verified identities, verified by their site, not with some universal digital ID, separate them from the anonymous types. Like if the anonymous types want to post, no problem, but they shouldn't get to post with the actual human beings. Because there's no responsibility, you know, and then you say, well, you know, maybe I'm a whistleblower and I'm standing for truth and I don't want to bear an undue responsibility for telling truth to power. It's like, my sense online is for every one whistleblower who's genuine, who's anonymous, there's 999 anonymous troll demons who are sadistic. Right?
Troll demons who are sadistic. Jesus,
you interviewed Bibi Netanyahu quite recently, actually, a few months ago. A lot of pressure on him internally, a lot of criticism. Hamas released a video on Monday of some of the hostages attacking Netanyahu's administration for not having a ceasefire and so on. That was clear propaganda. But it also reflects what a lot of people in Israel feel about Netanyahu and the catastrophic failure of security and defense on October the 7th. He's resolutely refused to accept any responsibility or to apologize for that. Do you think he should?
Well, I guess I wouldn't presume to know. I mean, my observation about that was that, you know, people said, well, how could this happen? How could the Israeli defense systems be that porous? And I would say, our defense systems are way more porous than anybody would ever want to think. You know, it's very, very difficult to stop people who are willing to light themselves on fire to singe you. And any random person in a civilized society can cause an unbelievable amount of mayhem and trouble. And in order to forestall that possibility completely, which would be impossible in any case, we'd have to move towards a surveillance state like China, where we're being monitored 100% of the time, and then the bloody cure would be worse than the disease. It doesn't surprise me that Israel's defense was that porous. I don't think it cannot be in a society that's still vaguely free. And even if you lock people down, Jesus, you can still cause a lot of trouble if you're hell-bent on doing it. So, should Netanyahu apologize for the failures of...
Nu, tipo, kol mes visi galim, man atrodo, nu, kaip aš, kol mes galim suprasti, kad, nu, greičiausiai, nu, net prie geriausių norų tu nuo tokių visokių atakų, nu, neapsiginsi. Gal šitą turėjom, gal ne, bet kaip bebūtų. Galų gale atsakomybė turi kristi ant, nu, tų, kurie buvo valdžioj, tipo, nu, ir kurie tos sprendimus priminėjo ir kurie, tipo, dropino the ball. Kartais tai būna, kad tiesiog, aigės, nepasisekė tam žmogui, bet tokia saugumo, ypač kai tą ten žadi žmonėm ir sakai, kad saugus bus ir tada jie nėra saugus. Techniškai ant tavęs krenta atsakomybė, tai techniškai ant Netanyahu tikrai krenta. Ir ant ten turbūt saugos ten ministrų dar keleto, bet tipo, turbūt visiškai fair prašyti, sakyti, kad, nu, kad jisai tipo, nu, nevykdė pareigų mūsų standartam, žinai, ir nu, mes keisti kažką norim.
The Israeli defense system in relationship to the Hamas attack? I don't know enough to say. It isn't obvious to me that it failed any worse than you should expect a system like that to fail when it's faced by psychopathic terrorists who are being funded by outside sources who want to do nothing else but cause misery and mayhem. So I interviewed Netanyahu partly because I wanted to talk to him, because I was curious, and I was also an admirer of his economic reforms, the economic reforms that I think did raise Israel to this position of pronounced economic power and entrepreneurial capacity that they now possess, which also made them a more attractive partner during the Abraham Accords, because the Israelis had the possibility of offering to the Arabs the sharing of their technology and their entrepreneurial and managerial prowess. They had something to offer along with their, military strength. So I thought that was all to the good. I don't know enough about Netanyahu and about the intricacies of Israel politics. God, it's hard enough keeping track of my own country, to dare to say anything more than that. I'm glad I'm not in his shoes. How about that? That's, I can't imagine there's anything about that that's anything other than abysmally difficult non-stop. So
let's turn, Jordan, to the ARC conference. It's why you're in London and I'm actually in Los Angeles at the moment. The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. This is your brainchild. A huge event, a lot of very interesting speakers from all around the world. You've made it clear it's driven by a desire to be motivational rather than political. Explain that.
Well, I've traveled all over the world and met hundreds of thousands of people in various ways, and watched them and sampled public sentiment to the degree I was capable, and that was overwhelming, as we've discussed before. I had no idea, really. Like, I had a clinical practice, and I was pretty damn familiar with a reasonable swath. But I didn't understand how widespread the sense of demoralization had become, especially among young people, and I got a real taste of that. And
aš dabar šitoj vietoj pasakysiu, kai mes kalbėjom, tipo, jis buvo, su kuo jis iš tikro bendravo Lietuvoje? Nu, tie, kas buvo jo rate, ir tada tie, kurie susimokėjo, kad jo mitingrytą nueitų. Iš tų žmonių, kurie varė jo kalbą. Tačiau labai specifinė auditorija, labai netikėtinai specifinė auditorija. Jis realiai tam pasaulyje, kai keliauja, ir bendrauja su žmonėm per tos mitingrytus, jis su tokiais bendrauja, kurie tragiškai neatspindi net daugumos. Labas, Karina. Tai jo, tas gali būti, kad susidaro žmogus, bet čia tada ir būtų tas episteminis labiau burbulas. Bet vat aš nežinau, kiek žinai su kuo bendrauja, bet, nu, manyčiau, kiekvienoje šalyje žmonės, kurie varo į jo eventą ir paskui moka pinigus už to, kad su juo pabendrautų į meet and greet ar klausimą užduotų ranką paspaustų, nu, tai bus subsetas labai tam tikros specifinės auditorijos žmonių. Tai jo, ką žinai, jisai labai ten objektyviai ar ką galėtų įvertinti iš tos pusės. O gal jis daug daugiau iš tikrųjų sutinka, nu.
I'm tired of the zero-sum apology.
Nu, nes čia, pavyzdžiui, jo dabar, įsivaizduokit, va, pašnekėjęs ten, nu, tarkim, nes Orlauskas su Sinica, nu, bet, va, atėjo jo, ateina, va, tie, kokią tu nuomonę susidarytum, žinai, atvarai Lietuvą, pakalbėta, ne, kalbė apie psichologinius dalykus, apie teisybę, sakymą, tarkim, visiškai geranoriškai kalbė apie, nu, okei. Ir tada su tavim kalba, va, žmonės, labiausiai užduotas klausimas yra woke kultūra, su daugiausiai apvautų du net klausimai, woke kultūra, apie kokią religinės vertybės, dar kažką, nu, tipo, okei, tu gali, tada pabendrauji ir visi čia ateina, nu, ble, čia su mūsų šalim iš tikro man nepatinka, kur čia mūsų politikai juda, nes jie šimtės nekenčia, taip gan malonų žmonės, išsilavinę viską, nes reikia pinigų, vis tiek, kad, nu, turėt, kad bent jau atvaryti tokį renginį, whatever, tipo, tvarkingi žmonės, viską. Tai tu dabar Petersono vietoj, kokį tu įvaizdį susidarai? Nu, šalis susirinko rafinuotą inteligentiją maždaug, su manim pašnekėjo ir jie visi pritarė, kad valdžia eina į kryptį blogą, šalis eina į kryptį blogą, woke kultūra čia ateina, reikia dėl to bijoti ir panašiai. Nu, tu susidarai realiai tokį vaizdą ir tu, kai iš šalies į šalį vaikštai, tau tikrai gali labai lengvai susidaryti vaizdas, nu, kad čia, jo, ta woke kultūra visam pasauliu, visose šalyse tiesiog tragiškai preveilant, tokia paplitus ir keblumų keliant visiems gyventojams, paprastiems žmonėms. Kai tu realiai tą sudarai nuomonę, tikrai ne iš paprastų žmonių ir negyventojų problemų ir panašiai. Nu, aš nežinau, čia visiškai spekulacija, aš nežinau, su kokiais žmonėms bendrauja, bet, nu, kai sako 100,000 žmonių bendraujant, tai greičiausiai per tos eventus po visas tas šalis varo. Tai jo, I'm not sure.
Apocalyptic fear-mongering story. I don't buy it. I don't think any bit of it is useful. I think it's extremely convenient who want to use the crisis to accrue power to themselves. And I think that the leader who motivates with fear is a tyrant.
Ne woke kultūra, o woke. W-O-K-E, woke.
Something to be afraid of, and I would say, yeah, there's always something to be afraid of. You know, does the apocalypse lurk in the future? It's like, yes, that's always been the case. So what's ARC's premises?
Woke žurnalo kultūra, jo, based kultūra.
You have a moral obligation to be optimistic about the future. That's a strange statement, right? And it's actually a statement of faith, because I would say, just as you...
Nu, pas mus jo yra woke kultūra, nes Šimonytė ir Landsbergis viską pavogė iš tai vat vagių kultūra, woke kultūra.
An obligation to be courageous about the challenges that confront you in the present. And just as that's the best way of dealing with those challenges, your default attitude towards the future should be, bring it on, we can handle it. And I would also say that if that is your default attitude, you're much more likely to be successful in your dealings with the future. And one of the things I've learned about classic religious or metaphysical faith is that a tremendous proportion of that is the faith that is courage, right? The courage to confront the unknown in the future with standing up straight with shoulders back, right? With the presumption that despite our flaws, we're intrinsically good, despite the misery in the world, it's intrinsically good, and that's the relationship we should establish with it. So that's the first part of the
techniškai ne, bet gal, whatever, dabar nesiplėsiu.
Part of the way that you face the future in a manner that makes of it the best it could be is to do that responsibly. To take responsibility for yourself, to put your life together, to tell the truth, to pursue high-order aims.
What if people are gay ir tai, beje, aš nežinau, gal reikės padaryti šitą epizodą, kokį mes čia pažiūrėjome. Aš žiūrėjau šiandieną, buvo, nu tą žiūrėjau, kaip tas komitetą dėl Gražulio apkaltos, į kurią Gražulis netėjo, bet tada ant galo pro duris atėjo ir pradėjo rėkauti. Tada Gražulis darė šitą spaudos konferenciją apie dvigubus standartus ir ten irgi wild buvo, bet žodžiu, visų pajėgumų varo. Tai gan entertaining yra iš tikrųjų žiūrėti apie tos gėjus ir ant kiek jis tiesiog, nu, išplautas smegenim savo tikėjimą, I don't know, bet ten, jo, bet jo, ten nebuvo labai ilgi video, gal reikės rytoj, gal tada, jeigu būtų laiko įjungčiau, pažiūrėtumėm būtų tas video, nes ten gan juokinga buvo, gerai žiūrim šitą toliau.
Take responsibility for your marital partner and vice versa, to do the same with your family, your local community, your town, your city, and that's your identity, that nested social web of obligations. That's your identity, and also that the meaning in your life is going to emerge as a consequence of
wild dalykus. Savo privačiu metu žiūriu, nestreamo. Wild. Čia wild parašiai su H raidė turbūt. Aš žiūriu off-stream ištisai viską. Ir aš nežinau, kur bus geras dalykas, kur ne, nes aš taip pat pasižiūriu ir ten 6 valandų tos Seimo posėdžius ir panašiai. Nu, paklausau. Ir aš nežinau, kurie, žinai, bus geri, kurie būna nuobodesni ar panašiai. Tuos komiteto posėdžius paklausau, kai kuriuos ten įdomesnius, ten, žodžiu. Ir aš labai daug visko off-stream klausausi, žiūriu ir panašiai, kur on-stream nežiūriu. Nes, nu, lesbionas, 9%, ko aš... Gal ne 9, tarkim, 100% būtų žiauriai neįdomu, arba man reiktų 6 valandas streamint. Nes, nu, aš 3 valandų video tiesiog negaliu žiūrėti. Beje, aš galvoju, gal reikėjo tą tutkau žiūrėti, iš tikrųjų, kur 2+ valandos ten vyko tas. Bet, anyway, nu, aš žiūriu jo ištisai labai daug dalykų ir klausaus daug dalykų. Ir iš tikrųjų ganėtinai nemažai paskaitau, bet man skaitimas sunku yra. Tai, yeah.
Of shouldering that responsibility. The meaning and the adventure in your life. And so confront the future with faith and courage and accept the responsibility that's commensurate with that. And that's the way you set the world straight. And that's not a political solution. That's a spiritual solution or a psychological solution. Now, it has political ramifications. But we're much more interested at ARC and at the ARC conference with the underlying substrate. The substrate about which the culture war is really raging, right? About the ultimate nature of reality in some way. And how you construe that. I think to some degree you have to construe it as a matter of faith, because we're all ignorant and limited in our knowledge, and so we have to make first pass approximations at what we're going to presume to be true. And so one set of presumptions is open your eyes, confront what frightens you,
and
move forward stalwartly, aim up, tell the truth. There's no evidence that that's correct, but you can start with that as a set of propositions, and then you could also make the claim, and I think this is a valid claim, you cannot be armed better in life other than with that set of propositions. Okay. And I think that's the Western claim. And that's what we're trying to communicate to the degree we can with this ARC conference.
Well, I think it's an excellent start. I mean, no more than that. Let's see how people respond to it. I was encouraged, actually, in the last few days by the news breaking here in Hollywood that Disney have decided to put back the release of their new version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by following the huge backlash.
Oh,
actually, as it wasn't going to have any dwarves in it, I think one. The rest were going to be fully bodied people, male, female, black, white, so on and so on, ticking every possible virtue signaling box. And I actually interviewed one of the leading dwarf actors in the world who said,
virtue signaling box. Virtue signaling nėra blogas dalykas, nebent tą darai nenuoširdžiai. Tai, kad tie filmai tapo labai inclusive, tai gali būti blogas dalykas, kur labai jau specialiai kišėjo, tu tų vertybių neturi ir tau vienodai, ko mes negalim numatyti. Gal režisieriai turi tas vertybės ir tai nėra blogai. Bet man atrodo padeda žmonių tolerancijai, padeda mere exposure argumentas. Padeda žmonėm matyti įvairiausius žmonės visokiose rolėse. Ir mažas, ir didelis, ir baltas, ir juodas, ir visų spalvų, ir viską. Padeda. Tikrai padeda. Man atrodo, pakankamai studijos jau yra išėję, kad žmonių psichologijai padeda matyti tos žmonės ekrane visokiose, superherojų vaidmenys ir panašiai. Arba apsitai ekranuose. Tai, tas toks pasakymas, o čia tavo kultūra, o čia virtue signalimas. Kol gali tai būti, bet vien tai, kad tu rodai, kokias vertybės turi, tai nebūtinai yra blogas dalykas. Tai, anyway, gerai, toliau žiūrėjau.
How dare they put me out of work like this? This is one of the most prized jobs in the world for any dwarf actor, being in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And it was a very good point, of course, that in their surge towards supposed equality, they were actually stopping the very people for whom this would have been the #1 gig in town from getting that gig. But they now put it back and apparently are going to go back to potentially even using CGI dwarves in the movie, which seems to me a significant climb down by Disney. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it's perversely analogous to the case that we're trying to make at ARC. So there's an underlying metaphysical or narrative reality. And you can warp and bend that with an ideology, but the ideology doesn't map well onto the underlying reality. And so so how would that play out in the case of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Well, that's a very old story. And some folk tales, we have anthropological evidence that some folk tales can be up to 10, 15,000 years old, extremely old. Well, there's a reason that they lay themselves out the way they do. It's the logic of the narrative world. So I can give an example with Snow White. Well, why is Snow White surrounded by dwarfs? When she reaches the peak of her beauty, why is she surrounded by dwarfs? Why do they have to be dwarfs? And the answer is, a stellar young woman finds herself surrounded by dwarfs. Right? That's the universal position of an extremely well put together young woman. There's going to be men around her who aren't what they could be, right? They're much smaller than they need to be. And why is she waiting for a prince? Well, because she's a princess. That's why. Waiting.
Aš čia jau pamečiau mintį, ką Petersonas šneka, aš užsigalvoju apie Snieguolį ir savitiniais dvarfais, žinok.
This is the eternal situation of women. They're going to be waiting for not only their master, but maybe for someone that they actually admire. And that's not to be found around the dwarfs. Now you can't just take that and say, well, let's throw some random diversity people in there. It's like the story has a coherence. And the coherence transcends easy understanding. You know, it wouldn't have that magical, mythical element that fairy tales have if the narrative didn't transcend the understanding. One of the things we're trying to do with ARC is to remind people that our civilization exists in a metaphysic, in a story, right? It's a divine story, and that the divine story has its reasons that transcend reason. It's where Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, he
Jungas,
of the way the world worked.
Matot, net aš citavau Jungą šitam pokalbį. Net aš. Matot, aš lygiai toks pat protingas kaip Jonas Petersonas, nes aš ir galiu pacituoti Jungą. Ta vieną citatą. Gerai, to be honest, aš dvi citatas turiu dar apie šešėlį. Anyway.
They're absolutely beyond our comprehension. And then there are things that we understand explicitly and in detail. But there's a border between them. So imagine, there's not a cutoff line, so you go from things you understand completely to things you understand not at all. The border is the land of the dream, the land of the story, the land of the fantasy, the land of myth. It's half unknown and mysterious, like the lands in The Lord of the Rings. And it's half explicit and understandable. And it's the place that the unknown moves through before it becomes explicit.
Žinot, kas dar Jungą mėgsta? Šiaurės Korėja.
Our Western philosophical tradition, with its reliance on rights, let's say, and its insistence upon the dignity of each individual, exists with
metaphysics. And that is the
Judeo-Christian story. Now, we don't know what to make of that rationally, but it fills a gap. And if you tear it out or transform it into an ideology, all that happens is half-formed pathological fantasies take its place. And that's what's happening. Everyone sees this, you know, and Nietzsche predicted it in the late 1870s or thereabouts, you know. God will die and the realm of ideology will rise up to take its place. And if you think that Christianity or Judaism was superstitious and insane, it's like, just wait till you see what replaces it. And so that's exactly what we're seeing. And it's happening very, very rapidly. And everyone has that sense. This art conference, the press coverage has actually been quite interesting because even on the left-wing side, I wouldn't say it's been laudatory on the left-wing side, but it's been pretty even-handed and neutral, which is quite remarkable. And the reason for that, I think, Piers, is that people are so tired of the endless diet of nihilistic apocalypse that even those who can't see their way out of it rationally hope that something else could be provided as an alternative.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, what a fascinating hour. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, and best of luck with the conference. I think it's a great idea. It's a great thing to get people with good ideas together, even if they're bad ideas, actually. Just debate ideas and to have a positive view of how we can make things better, not worse. Get away from nihilism, get the opposite of nihilism into the ideology of the world would be a great starting block. So I thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Yeah, well, it's good to know that it might be courage that's the opposite of nihilism.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Piers.
Okay, tas buvo fine pokalbis. Manau, net Petersono heiteriai nelabai turėtų čia, nu, kritikuoti viską galima, aišku, bet, tipo, manau, turėtų, it was fine, gan įdomiai visai pašnekėjo apie daug dalykų ir jokių labai ten kontroversiškų nuomonę turėjo, aišku, biškai ant valdžios pasmę, biškai ant kito pasmę, gal savo interpretaciją vieną kitą pasako, kur ten nepritars ten kiti žmonės, bet manau, visai fine buvo pokalbis tarp abiejų čia. Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdim man kelia.
many